The process of scientific discovery is not like anything we have, right? There is an iterative process that happened in the past that led to this form of development, right? The cure is not called Muir's cure in the first place, right? Firstly, how do we differ from OO? They have a fundamental focus on the profits thing and like the battling of this consent, right? Like, sure, this is fine, but we're going to prove the systematic aspect of this practice, i.e., the iterative process of medical research, why consent is important, but the application is misconstrued by all benches, and why the procedure has always existed, and we're going to prove why a lot of the cases coming from CG is going to be null, right? Clarifications then. This is a value judgment on the perspective of the third party observer and how it's going to affect that particular person, right? It's not just an actor motion about which particular benefit is going to side with John Moore. It's going to be something that's on the macro. Two paths to victory. First, we're going to prove why we don't diminish this consent, and to an extent, why the full disclosure coming from CG is just untrue. And second, we're just going to prove why the precedent it sets is unlikely to be as harmful as they say, and how it's going to actually be beneficial in the long run, right? Like, three responses first. CG push on the full disclosure operating on a perfect world. Like, university hospitals and doctors who take the Hippocratic Oath do their best for patients to make the most informed decision given limited information and changing conditions. What this means is that it is just a coincidence that they're able to extract those cells and be able to extract value from it later on. It's not something that they try to find to like be able to profit from it. It's something that they do because it's a necessity in their job. Second, this debate is not about patients being able to file for suits or not. On both sides, they are free to do what they wish. But the flip to both CG and OG is the extremely dangerous precedent it creates that backtracks the time and investment that industries put in for drug development and commercial rollout of new drugs. If John Moore wants to sue the specific doctors for malpractice, negligence, or damages, he can, but that does not mean automatically the courts have to rule in his favor specifically towards the revenue over these drugs, right? A lot of what CG says is symmetric and not even contention. The harm is that they create dangerous precedent of ownership spamming over the claim to any single cell that comes from your body that impedes on drug development and commercial distribution. Clarifications again. Generally, remember the condition here in this debate. This debate is not just about consent, but whether on Moore is entitled to financial gains from the discovery. This is something we agree on from OO, but let's expand this further, right? First clash. How do we win the consent thing, right? So we're just going to prove why this thing about consent is just so muddled coming from upside, right? Like three examples, right? Existing laws to the removal of limbs is independent of the debate. Second, it's legally vague how these cells are owned, but that's because not a single cell should be credited. Relation person, right? So don't definition of consent specific instruction itself is a violation of ethics in the scientific community. The only example here is when you lived or possibly sold for perverse reasons, such as cannibalism, right? The thing is, we agree on this premise that where the removed body part is used in a manner that is degrading, shocking, or otherwise offensive to basic human dignity, consent remains necessary because the proposed use continues to implicate the individual's personal dignity and identity. Sure, they can have that. But judge, listen well. That case is materially different from what Kuya Joseph offers, an ordinary downstream or unknown uses of extracted tissue that cannot be reflected to your selfhood. The dignitary interest protected by law does not persist indefinitely once the material has been removed, rendered separate from the person, and no longer bears a meaningful connection to the individual as such, right? Thus, the law protects the patient's right to withhold consent where the proposed act still concerns the person in a direct dignitary sense, but not a continuing right to control every later specific medical or commercial use after the material has become independent biological matter. The more direct the affront to personhood, the stronger the claim to consent. The more remote, transformed, and impersonal the use becomes, the weaker that claim must be. This is the clear distinction that OO failed to meet because they also have had hard in creating a shade in this debate, right? Already government is losing in the majority of cases here because their case is too vague to judge and it's simply uncomparative in nature, right? What does this mean for the round? You can blast all the dramatic cases and we're willing to agree with that, right? It's just that it's not proportional to the nature and spirit of the issue here in the motion, and no amount of case affects the procedure that they offer. This debate is super specific and not a general debate, right? So in Gov, you produce a distortion in how the law allocates right and value, right? So the explanation to this is like a claim grounded in dignity is not the same as a claim of ownership, because the former protects the person against insult or misuse, while the latter confers continuing control over the thing itself. If both are treated as interchangeable, a limited right to object at the point of removal is converted into an indefinite claim over the latter use of material. That's why innovation is messy on your side, right? This is why you get less and less innovation, as what Kuya Yusuf mentioned. Just because a bad precedent the governments want to do, just take a look at the possible ridiculous lawsuits that will be launched further in the landscape, like for example in the US, if we create this kind of practices, right? Owo explained the claim that these cells are separated to your personhood, but there's still a tension in top half on why that should be treated as detached from your right to autonomy. We're the only ones who analyze why that's really the case and why government's own example is just crazy, right? But on the second part of this, CG said that you're entitled to the financial claim because your cell was so unique. The flip to this argument is that the fact that the person's tissue later proves to be biologically rare or valuable does not by itself generate a legal entitlement to share in resulting profits. The law does not recognize a proprietary right arising from just mere biological uniqueness, because such uniqueness is neither the product of labor nor of deliberate creation. This is the implication coming from Kuya Yosef that was clearly expanded on, unresponded to by closing government. A clear medical example, right? When a person donates blood and it is later separated into plasma, platelets, or used to develop commercially valuable treatments, the donor does not acquire a right to share in the resulting profits simply because the material came from their body, right? To treat it as a source of entitlement would so you also get like lesser inclination to innovate, since the medical community is already bounded by this fear of further cost of lawsuits and also the existing budget constraints that they have. That's why only huge pharma and other bad faith actors can control the landscape of innovation on their side, since they can afford winning these lawsuits and it's easy for them to burn resources for this. Remember, this is like in a university hospital. They do not have the means like other medical institutions have. This is the nuance that every team here fails to acknowledge. That's why the president that you create destroys these groups of identities. To treat it as a source of entitlement would convert an accidental condition into a continuing claim over materials that have already been separated and transformed. This would depart from the settled principle that proprietary interests attached to acts of development, skill, and investment, not to passive origin, right? The patient's interest is therefore confined to consent at the point of extraction and does not extend to participation in the economic value subsequently generated by independent processes. And this is why CO takes this debate. You're here.